Well, welcome to church history, our first class of 2019. Thank you for coming back. That's awesome. I'm glad to see everybody's face. So let's start with a quick prayer, and then we will get into the lecture. Father God, I just thank you so much for your presence in our lives. Thank you for bringing each of us through this past holiday season. Thank you for getting us back into the routine of our lives after the holidays. Lord, I thank you for each person who's here tonight, who is willing to come back and just hopefully excited to learn a little bit more about the history of your church. Lord, for those who can't be here tonight, I pray that you will bless them and keep them safe. And Lord, whatever it is they're doing, I pray that you will just honor the time that they're giving to the task at hand. And Lord, for each of those people here tonight, I pray that you will open their minds, Lord, that you will speak through me, and that we will just be excited to learn about the Reformation. And we ask it all in your name, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so we have a tremendous amount of material to cover tonight. And we all know how I do with tremendous amounts of material. I end up getting behind. So I'm going to try to, this pre-Reformation part, I'm going to try to go through kind of fast, but hopefully not so fast that you feel like you're like getting confused or something like that. So one of the first things I want to say is we're going to be covering a period of history that's about three centuries, like 300 years, okay? And we're going to end up going back and forth through time as we're talking. So if you're a timeline kind of person, you're going to have to be real careful about how you are thinking about the notes we're taking. Most of this is in, fairly close chronological order, but it's very possible that we could start talking about one thing and then move on to something else, and then the next topic is right in the middle of those first two things or whatever, because we're going to just kind of be getting a general overview of how things began to change for the church and why they began to change. Okay, and then with the ultimate goal, getting to the Reformation. Okay, so we're going to be covering a time period, basically the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, basically, and we're going to be covering some of this, not just this week. We're going to, be doing it for a little while. But this pre-Reformation idea, this is closer to the 14th century side, because the Reformation, as we talked about for the quiz, officially begins in 1517, right? So pre-Reformation is going to be pre-1517, okay? All right, so in this pre-Reformation period, the authority of the papacy, which we've kind of already discussed a little bit, the authority of the papacy begins to decline a little bit. So remember basically starting with Innocent III, he was the canon lawyer that became the Pope, right? He started sort of throwing the authority of the church around in a heavy way. He did not come up with the idea of indulgences, and he did not come up with the idea of excommunication. I'm not so sure he didn't come up with the idea of the interdict, but I don't know that for sure. So, but he began to use those things in favor of the church in a heavy way. So if an individual wouldn't comply, they were excommunicated. If a leader wouldn't comply, then an interdict was placed, and the entire country, it meant that nobody in that leader's realm under that authority was able to be in fellowship or take communion. That was the big thing, was they were not able to take communion. So there was this big sort of wielding of power that was going on for, few hundred years, right? Well, as time moves on, and as these things do, threats become less threatening the longer they're used, right? You get less and less intimidated the longer you're threatened with the same thing. You just, in general, you're like, yeah, okay, I don't want to be excommunicated. It's not a shaking, trembling fear. You just still don't want it, and you're not excited about it, but you're like, it's just going to excommunicate me if I do that, instead of the authority the power begins to not mean so much. So this it's not necessarily in place of, but it's an interesting transition where the popes prior to this time were more interested still in ecclesiastical work on some level, that actually began to sort of go into the background in the same with them at sort of the same time that this authority started to go away with the people. And they kind of started getting away from ecclesiastical ideas, being the center, not that they forgot about them completely, but being the center of their time as Pope, and getting more into the arts and the artists and just the whole idea, whatever it is that comes to mind when you think about the Renaissance period, the popes began to embrace that in a big way. So they began to accumulate a tremendous amount of wealth. Now, at the time, I don't know that it was considered super wealthy. In retrospect, it's priceless because these popes, and we'll talk about we'll talk about some of these leaders and popes. It's not always the Pope, but it's these leaders who would bring in these artists from all over the countryside, not just their country, but around the continent, maybe you could say. They would bring in these artists that are well known, and they would commission them to do things. Sometimes those artists were treated with a lot of respect and a lot of dignity. They were given salaries, and they were given everything they needed to do their thing. Sometimes they were treated like we would treat anyone who was coming to our house to do a job. They weren't treated with special, ooh, you're an artist, you've got all this special talent, you've been gifted by God. They're just well, finish your job and let's move on. So sometimes they were treated well, sometimes they were treated not so well. But the popes and the governors in general, but the popes began to commission these people in, bring these artists in, and house them and give them small salaries, supply them with all this, whatever it is they needed to do their painting or their sculpting or, whatever it is that they did. And they began to create things for the church. And the church was not necessarily, in a way they were buying them, kind of, but they began to accumulate a lot of that wealth. And if you look back on my understanding, I've never been to the Vatican, but if you go to the Vatican today, there's a lot of that Renaissance period art that is still preserved at the Vatican, and it's priceless now. At the time, it was still worth something. It was being paid for, and it was very ornate and, looked at. It was a luxury. There was no way that the common person that didn't have money could, sponsor an artist to have them, create something like the Sistine Chapel, or whatever. Like Michelangelo. So exactly. Yeah, he was. That's over here. This guy commissions him. Anyway, so they had this. They began to crave or indulge in this more luxurious lifestyle, but that meant that they needed money to do that. Right? And we had already heard about in the conflict or whatever, the sort of butting heads between the church and the state where, okay, we'll give you protection if you give us money, and, kind of had that trade-off anyway. The church, but that's church and state, right? That's the government and the church who are, trying to scratch each other's back and blah, blah, right? But now we're getting more into the church on the people. So all that other stuff was still happening. But now the church is starting to require tithes. And not only require them, sometimes they would tell you how much you had to pay. And there are churches today, my understanding, again, I have not been a part of any church like that, but my understanding is that there are churches today that will require, for membership, they will require a tithe, and they will require proof of income in order to verify your tithe. Okay. All right. So the church began to require tithes from their people, right? They began to also impose ecclesiastical taxation. And I talked a little bit about this before. This is not a new concept. This is where, you have your founding church, or your large church, the regional church, right? And then you have all the churches that sort of fall underneath them. Well, the Vatican would tax this church, the big church, and this church would tax all the little churches. All the little churches would tax the people, and these churches would tax the people too. And then, so the little churches would pay ecclesiastical taxes to their authority church, whatever, regional church, and then all the regional churches would pay to the Vatican.
The regional pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
That's funny. I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. And so that was another way to bring money in. And again, this is still a time when people respected the church, and their desire was to stay in good standing. Sometimes that desire was completely based around, I just want to get what I need to get and get out of here. And sometimes it was because they had a love for God, just like it is today. And also these indulgences. Indulgences were not begun here, as you know. They began, around the time of Innocent, but the indulgences became a very strong practice at this time. And sometimes, the church was not necessarily being underhanded about what they were doing. They would actually go out and say, we are raising funds to build St. Peter's Basilica. Who wants to get their person out of purgatory? You know what I'm saying? So it's not like the people were being completely snowed, like they didn't know where the money was going, or there was that it was a fundraising campaign. What they probably didn't know was that not all the money was going to where it was being said it was being taken. Wow, I don't even know what that sentence was. What they probably didn't know was when the church said, we're doing basically these are my words, we're doing a fundraiser for this, or this, maybe most, maybe part, whatever, a portion would actually go there, but the rest of it would go into their church or their pocket, or they did what they wanted with the indulgence, right? And the people did not, either they didn't know it, they didn't care, or they were too afraid to ask. Okay? Because again, if you are seeking something that is to benefit you and you upset the person, it's sort of like when I get my blood drawn and the person says, so how are you doing today? And I said, I'm doing fine if you are. You're the one with the needle. So I am super good as long as you are. It's just not something you want to do, is insult your phlebotomist right before they stick you, right? It's just common sense. Same thing here. You don't want to poke the bear if you think that they're going to
Eat you.
if you think they're going to help get your loved ones out of, purgatory, or reduce your own sentence, or, whatever it is that they were promising to do, right? So people were genuinely fearful of coming up against this in any real way. And again, I'm not really sure that the people asked a lot of questions. I'm not sure that they, even thought to ask. Who knows, right?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. I don't know if I can answer it, but you can ask.
After the sentence you just said, I'm thinking, well, how many people back then were literate?
Not many. That's actually exactly where we're going. I am going to answer your question with this lecture. No, it is. That's right. Not very many of them were literate at this time.
That's a question they probably didn't know to ask.
That's a very good point. That's very possible. Especially the quote unquote lower class you were. You just did what you were told and you moved on with life, right? Okay. So now, in Spain, so this is more kind of centered around Rome and, other places, not just Rome, but this is sort of one part of, or this is Italy, right? So now let's move over to Spain, sort of a sister country, right? Now in Spain, during this time period, and we've talked about some of this before, so we're going to kind of breeze through it. In Spain, around this time, Ferdinand and Isabella were able to drive out the Muslims from that area. Once the Muslims were driven out of that area, they gained a tremendous amount of power. Well, they became the leaders, but they were very powerful. And again, that's what happens when there is a perceived threat, and then somebody comes in and removes that threat. The reaction of the people is gratefulness, right? Yay, I'm glad we don't have to do that anymore. Just like the whole Rome thing, they would come in and take over the city, wouldn't give them a choice, take over the territory, clean it up, make everybody, give them jobs, make it safe. And they were like, yay, Rome, right? So this is kind of what was happening in Spain. They were grateful for the change of at least this part of the society, okay? So Ferdinand and Isabella, we talked about this a little bit. They were responsible for instituting what we call the Spanish Inquisition. And depending on what source you look at, most of the sources say 1470 to 1480-ish, right? But the end date, it's very interesting. It just is all over the place. So the Spanish Inquisition, we're just going to talk about that it basically started at the time that Ferdinand and Isabella came into power. And so this was the deal. And now remember, we are looking at this solely as a religious study or a church history study, right? I'm not talking about any other part of the politics. And I'm not saying they don't exist, we're just not talking about them, right? So don't forget that when we're going through some of this stuff. There's other things in the mix. It's not all about, but religion was a big thing, right? So the Muslims are out, and they're trying to reunite their territory now. And what they want to do, given that this threat or perceived threat is gone, they want to reunite their empire or their territories, and they're doing the same thing that Constantine did and several other emperors as leaders. They're going to use their chosen religion, and they're going to use that to bring everybody together and get them on the same page. Well, they hired a man. He was a Dominican, so he was a monk, a Dominican friar, and his name was Tomás de Torquemada. I don't know if that's how you say it or not. That was my guess. That was my best attempt. Anyway, they hired this guy, Tomás, and if you look him up, it's very interesting. If you have 5 or 10 minutes one day, you should look up, just, put his name into Google. Some pretty crazy things pop out. Like he is primarily known for his violence and his harshness and his just crazy behavior. Okay. He was the leader of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, because remember when we were talking about the Crusades, we talked about this other Inquisition that was sort of small. This is the big Inquisition. Like when you say Inquisition, everyone thinks Spanish Inquisition, right?
Is that like a battle?
No, this is what it is. It's because they were trying to reunite everything using religion. What they would do is basically go out, and they were doing the same thing that the Roman government was doing with, are you a Christian or are you a pagan, right? They were basically stopping people and saying, are you a Christian or are you a Catholic Christian, right? Are you a Catholic? And the person would either say, yes, I am, and this is what I do, and this is how I do it, and they would inquire. They would have an inquisition. They would inquire about them. Okay, so if the person was found to be truthful, everything is fine and good, right? I don't know that they gave out certificates or anything like that. I've never read anything like that. But if they believed you, if you said, yes, I'm a Catholic, and they believed you, you were golden. If, however, they asked you the question and you were like, well, or you just flat out said, no, I'm not a Christian, I'm a pagan, or whatever. Or if they didn't believe you, if you were scared, can you imagine just being scared and being like, yeah, I'm a Catholic, and they're like, whatever. If you flat out said that you were not, you were very likely going to be tortured or you were going to be killed. The torture was in place to try to get you to change your mind. Right? So it wasn't necessarily an automatic death sentence, but it was an eventual death sentence if you didn't comply, right? If you were somebody who began with a no and changed your mind, or that they weren't quite sure they believed you from the beginning, you were still in trouble. Because even if they walked away saying, oh yeah, we believe that, you say you're Catholic, we'll believe you, they watched them. And they watched their behavior, and they made sure that you were doing what you said you were going to be doing. Now, not every citizen can be watched. It's not, it's not quite that crazy. But sometimes people would say, oh, yes, I am. And if they didn't believe them, they'd go in and they would still inquire. They would still go through some measure of torture. You had to convince the person who was talking to you that you were telling the truth or that you really were Catholic, right? And that person, if they happen to be a little sadistic, if they happen to like power, if they happen to enjoy watching people squirm or go through some pain or, whatever, you're in a bad position. You could be telling the truth, and if you got somebody in an ultimate authority that has the authority to do what they want with you, and so there was a lot of corruption within the Inquisition, which is that's not what it was meant to be. It was meant to, their idea was not what it ended up being. It's kind of like the Crusades. Their idea was genuinely to reunite all of their territories and get everybody on the same page. Well, if you're not Catholic, then why? What can we do? How can we show you that this is the right way to live your life? That was the initial idea. But, people are people, and, years and years of bad things happened, okay? But this guy, he's interesting. If Fox's Book of Martyrs is all you can handle, he did some crazy stuff. Anyway, so when the Spanish Inquisition was in full force, there was a dispersion of sorts, okay? There were people who either were not Christian or couldn't convince anybody they were Christian or, whatever. And so they would end up leaving the area because they didn't want, they needed to get away from the Inquisition, and they would disperse to different places. And just as a side note, some of those went into Mexico, and some of those dispersed people came up. And the reason I have Jews here is because there were Jews living in Spain at the time. And so they would say, "Are you a Catholic?" "No, I'm Jewish." Right? That's not a good answer. So there was a dispersion, not just of Jewish people, but there was a dispersion in general of people trying to get away from inquisitors. One section or subset of those people were Jewish people that migrated to Mexico and then ended up over time migrating up into New Mexico, especially northern New Mexico. And there's a whole subset of Jewish people from the Spanish Inquisition dispersion. They're known as Sephardic Jews. And there are names, I only know one. I wish I could give you more than one name. But in Hebrew, one Hebrew word for God is El, like Elohim, right? El. And that name, or the name of God being in somebody's actual name, they would change it just a little bit so it wouldn't be as recognizable. And so one of the Sephardic Jewish names is Rael, Rael. Okay. There are others. I think Chavez is one too, but I can't break that one down. But anyway, so it doesn't mean that every person who has that last name is a Sephardic Jew, but it's very likely that if they could trace their ancestry back, it would very likely somehow end up in Spain, and their dispersion very likely happened around the time of the Inquisition. So that's just a side note.
I've heard of some people look at like old gravestones and stuff with the Jewish symbol on it.
Mm-hmm. The Star of David?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even now, within the city, within Albuquerque, there's a whole I don't know how many, but there's a population of Jewish people. They're not all Sephardic. You've heard of like Ashkenazi Jews. That's a different, those are German Jews, right? And these are Spanish Jews. But there's just different subsets. And still, especially after the Inquisition, there would be no talking about their Jewish ancestry. They would disperse and they would come into a new area. That was it. There was nothing said about their ancestry at all. They raised their children. It's very interesting. They would raise, not everybody, but many would raise their children doing Jewish traditions, going through Jewish traditions, like having dreidels around the time of not Ramadan, but Hanukkah, thank you. They would have these little traditions and the traditional foods and some of the kind of ceremonies, sort of. So the kids would grow up knowing what all these things are, but not having a background for it. And then as adults, especially now, because there's not any organized persecution of Jewish people now. And it's interesting, these people who are now adults that, maybe much older, they be grandchildren or great grandchildren, whatever, I have never talked to them. This was my Hebrew teacher telling me this. She has noticed, and her family is part of that whole thing. And so all of the kids know all of these Jewish traditions. And every year the JCC has a, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I'm not remembering any words. They have the Passover meal, the Seder meal. Okay. Whenever those things started to be organized, not just in Albuquerque, but in general, whenever those things started to be organized and people were less scared and they started to, sort of come out of the closet, for lack of a better word, yes, I'm Jewish. Yes, this is what it is. This is, whatever. And they began to organize and meet as Jewish people and bring back some of the traditions out in the open. It was amazing because everybody knew all of the traditions. They just didn't know they knew them because they were still raised with all of them. They just weren't raised with the knowledge of all of them. So they kind of had to go back and learn what all this stuff means, but they were like, oh, we did that. Oh, well, we did that too. Oh, well, I already know how to do that. Well, we had that every year at that time. So it's very interesting. They were very, for the most part, very continuous in the way that they raised their kids, but there was absolutely no verbalizing for a very, very, very long time because this was a very serious time frame. It was a bad deal.
Dispersed because of
they were getting away from the inquisitors. Mm-hmm. Okay, so wow. So I'm so totally not going fast enough. Okay, so now, one thing that happened, this is not the only thing, but one thing that happened, and this is going to start to answer the question you asked. So the Byzantines, they were kind of dispersed all across Eastern Europe and up into where Bulgaria and Russia, all across the northern and the eastern sides. And so these Byzantines happened to be Greek speakers. And they were just, I don't know how they ended up coming into Florence, but they did. There was a whole group of people. Maybe it was just the luxury of maybe they just had money. I don't really know exactly how this worked out, but basically there was an influx of Byzantine that's going back to that. Greek-speaking Byzantine people that came into Italy, and a subset came into Florence. With them, they were primarily Eastern Orthodox too, but whatever, or Greek. They would call themselves Greek Orthodox, but anyway. So with them, they brought in the Greek language, and the people who were there. Basically what they said was, if you learn Greek, you're going to be able to read the New Testament in the original language. And people who were, sort of into the arts and into what was cool and cultural and, sort of whatever, it became a very cool thing. And so people were learning Greek. That to me is amazing. Like a whole group of people, people learning Greek like it's easy. Right? That's a God thing as far as I'm concerned. So the Greek language sort of took root in Italy and it began to flourish, and people started to become literate. People started to be able to understand and sometimes read the Greek language. The ones who had the money and the ability, they would actually learn to read it, and they were pulling original Greek texts and they were starting to read the original language. When that happened, the Vulgate began to go under fire. They began to say, the Vulgate is mistranslated here, here, and here. That is not what the original language says, right? And they start going against the known authority of the church at the time. That was a big deal. Around the same time, remember we talked about this very briefly back in the day whenever we talked about it when the donation of Constantine was supposedly created. So remember, the donation of Constantine was was the Papal States. It was a piece of paper that was promised to the church, where Pippin promised these lands to the church, right? And later on, it became an issue whenever the government started coming in, when things started getting crazy and there was all this fighting between the church and the state, and the church says, no, that belongs to us. And boop, kind of like the golden calf, out pops the donation of Constantine. And they're like, see, it's ours. we have proof right here. And they were like, okay, it's yours. And we moved on with life. It was around this time that Lorenzo Valla, this is his birth and death. So in this time frame, in the 15th century, he disproved the donation of Constantine. It was not recognized by the church at this time. It was later that it was recognized, but this is when he did the work to disprove it. And that's very interesting too, if you guys have time to look that up. Also, one of the things that was discovered by the people in and around this area is that the Apostles' Creed was not written by the apostles. That freaked everybody out. The creed was not written by the apostles. They assumed, because of the name, all these years, that the apostles must have written it because it's the Apostles' Creed. It was written like 400 years after any of those apostles were even alive. And it was around this time that these people were becoming literate and they were beginning to read and understand for themselves. This sort of information over time, right? We're talking about years and years of time, began to spark the interest of the people. So what was happening is people were becoming literate. This stuff was, hitting the internet, hitting the news. Everyone's starting to learn about these things, right? So parents are saying, oh my goodness, I am teaching my kid Greek. I'm going to make sure they can read. I'm going to make sure they can think critically. I'm going to make sure they're educated because we have been snowed for the last, up to 100 years and it's over. My kids are not going to be that way, right? So this whole movement of education started to go through, not just Italy, but that's what we're talking about now, but it just began to root and people began to really push and respect and want education, okay? All right, so now about this time, so all this stuff is happening in the background, right? In Florence, there was a man, he was a governor. His name is Cosimo de Medici. I think that's how you say that. I don't even know if that's right. But anyway, that's him, right? So, Medici? Oh, right, because he's Italian, Medici. Anyway, so let me read a little bit about him. He was a politician. He loved the arts. He was one of those, not popes, but governors, who brought in artists at the time. He was wealthy and he was able to afford bringing in time. He valued them. He treated them with great respect. If he saw an artisan who was not being treated with the respect he thought, he would buy them or he would woo them away and he would have them work for him. He was just extremely excited about art. He loved it and he wanted it produced. He was educated in Greek and in Latin. He was a poet. He invested in Michelangelo. I think we talked about that. Anyway, so he was just one of these governors who was like a Renaissance governor. He loved bringing in and supporting the arts, right? Well, he had a son. His name is Giovanni, right? Giovanni, eventually, he's going to come back into play a little bit later. He eventually becomes Pope Leo X. Whenever we talk about Luther, this is the Pope who is primarily going after Luther. Okay? All right. In your textbook, you don't have to mark this. I'm just giving it to you for information. I'm not going to test you on it. But in your textbook, if you look on page 534, beginning with Nicholas V all the way down through Leo X, those are basically the Renaissance popes. If you wanted to, I kind of have the term up here, Renaissance popes. Those are the popes who were alive during the Renaissance. They were the artsy popes, and their focus began to move from the ecclesiastical onto other things, like distractions, which art could be a distraction. It doesn't mean they were anti-ecclesiastical, and it doesn't mean that they didn't do their job. It just means that this became almost more important, okay? Lots and lots of wealth. I think I said 534.
534?
Yeah, in the very back. It's in the list of popes.
Oh, okay.
And it's Nicholas V. It's in the first column about 3/4 of the way down. 1447, Nicholas V down through Leo X. All right. So these Renaissance popes, in general, this is so general, okay? They amassed a great amount of wealth, not just for the church, and not, I mean, we're talking about, as far as the church is concerned, we're talking buildings and ornate, like not Eastern Orthodoxy ornate because they're real gold and shiny and shimmery, but just art, and gold was definitely part of it, but just really like sculptures and paintings and all of these things to enhance the beauty of these churches, building beautiful churches from scratch, like St. Peter's Basilica. I mean, just amazing structures were built and or refurbished during this time. A great amount of wealth went into the churches, but these popes also amassed personally a great amount of wealth. Okay? They funded the arts for the most part. They renovated the Vatican. I kind of already talked about that. As time went on, there was a general degradation in morality. Okay? And that is not because art brings immorality. That's not the case. But distraction does, right? They began to focus so much on the luxury and the money and the art and the this and the that, that pleasure and luxury sort of replaced the original ecclesiastic idea of aesthetic living, right? We're way past that. There's nobody who is sleeping on a stone floor anymore. There is nobody who's missing a meal, right? So much so that a lot of the relatives of the people were getting jobs. That was happening a lot as time went on. So instead of bringing in somebody who actually had a background in some kind of religious study or Catholic study, they would say, oh, my nephew needs a job. Okay, you're over that church. You're over that church. You're over that church. And so they'd come in, and literally some of these guys would come in and they're like, okay, I'll run the church. So what do I do? Oh, I just have to sign that form? I just have to say yes or no? Oh, I just have to make that decision? I mean, literally, they had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know Latin. They didn't understand. They memorized. I mean, I hear about that. I don't actually know that it's necessarily true, but like English-speaking Jewish people who go through their bar and bat mitzvahs, if you don't know Hebrew, there's a whole list of prayers that have to be said, and there's all this Hebrew business that goes on during the ceremonial part of those coming of age ceremonies. They don't know Hebrew. They're taught, and they're taught how to say the words correctly. They're taught how to pronounce things and emphasize things. They're taught it correctly, but it's transliterated. They don't really know what they're reading. They might learn a little bit, just like we do. Like if I sit down and watch a Spanish-speaking show with English subtitles, I pick up on words. I may not remember them, but I pick up on words. And it's the same thing. I mean, they were going and learning all this stuff, but they didn't really know. They know what they're saying because the priest, that was a bad slip. The rabbi, is telling them this is what it means. Right? And there's like, okay, that's what it means. That's what was happening. So these people were coming in that had no real education or background, and they were giving Latin services, right? They don't know what they're saying. Well, all this is happening at the same time, right? The Greek language is being learned. The Latin language is being learned. So here comes smarty pants people into the church, and there's, nephew, whoever, running the place, and they come in and they start saying, so, it says here in Latin, la 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 la. What do you think about that? Because that's not really what the translation in the Vulgate says. What's your opinion? And they're like, I don't know. What do you think? And so these people who had no ecclesiastical education knew more than the people who were running the church, and they were mortified. They were like, wow, right? So this trend where the authority of the church was starting to decline, by the time this comes around and the languages are starting to really set in and whatever, it's really taken hold now because people are like, they don't even know what they're talking about. I know more Latin than the priest knows, right? As a secular, uneducated as far as the church goes person. Well, that was not that was not so good. So as a person who I got my job because I know I'm related to somebody, and then I'm being sort of attacked because I don't know Latin and I'm just doing whatever. I'm doing what I'm told. Well, my attitude very well may be, well, whatever. I don't even have to worry about this person. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to come over here and buy some art. I'm going to bring somebody in to do that. It was a reason to get distracted for some people. I mean, that's a normal human reaction to be attacked and not be able to fend it off and be like, whatever, I'm going to go over here and do this. So it really just set in. The many of the leaders of the church, they were just not at all. They didn't even know how to do their job, much less actually be able to do it. Okay? So, all right, now.
You talking about the Catholic Church?
Yep, the Catholic Church. Okay, so now something else happens. While all of this is going on, there's a man named Gutenberg, I think. Yes. You know what? I'm going to use the green because it is not as dry. Okay, so you have this man. His name is Johannes Gutenberg. Okay? Johannes Gutenberg. He was in a very, again, right place, right time. God ordained this. So Johannes Gutenberg, up to this point, the way that a manuscript would be replicated, by and large, was you had to hire somebody to print the manuscript for you. Very expensive and very time-consuming. Lots of the monks who were still in business, that's what they did. They would copy the scriptures. Not necessarily outside sources, but they would copy the scriptures, right? So if you wanted something secular copied and the church wasn't willing to do it or whatever, you would have to find somebody who was educated enough to do it, and you would hire them and you would be paying them. I mean, it could take months or maybe even years, depending on how long the manuscript is to get it copied letter perfect, right? So prior to Johannes, there was an semblance of a printing press, and even in other countries. I think China had one, and I don't know. Anyway, there were a couple of other countries that had, besides this area of Germany, that had these printing presses, and they were wooden, okay? They were wooden blocks that would imprint onto the page, right? And the problem with them is that they kind of got loose fitting over time because, wood expands and contracts with, temperature and blah, blah, right, humidity, and they would degrade. And so the printing presses worked, but they weren't very efficient. And so they were almost as expensive, not as time consuming, but almost as expensive to get a manuscript done by the printing press as it was to hire somebody to do it, right? But it was faster. So Johannes Gutenberg, he actually did not invent the printing press, but renovated it and took it from being a wooden structure to being a more metal-based structure. He was also responsible, from what I read today, I hadn't read this before, he was also responsible for mixing a kind of ink, a special oil-based ink that not only stuck to the metal base of the printing press blocks, but also imprinted well on the paper of the time. Right? So what good does it do to have a printing press with ink that either doesn't stick to the block or doesn't come off or doesn't stick to the paper, right? So he kind of did both things. He kind of revamped the printing press and made it work well, and kind of had this mindset of there are all these different parts, and if you make the parts right, if that part breaks, you just replace the part. Okay? So he didn't invent. A lot of the things I've read says that he invented the printing press. I mean, not really. He just reinvented it and made it efficient and made it useful, right? So, for example, a person could be paid a salary of $20,000. That's current money. Okay, an equivalent of $20,000 to copy a manuscript. Okay? The printing press was able to copy the exact same manuscript for $2,000, but not just $2,000, 3,000 copies of it. So it went from, Johannes Gutenberg basically took this time frame when people were learning and reading and hungry and just wanting more and more and more. His invention made it possible for the layman to get a hold of things at a decent price. I mean, sometimes things were being printed and just given. You didn't even have to pay for it sometimes, right? So it was a major player in what was happening at this time as far as church history is concerned. So Johannes Gutenberg is very, 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 very important. People had access to books. It was easier, it was cheaper, it was faster. A very illiterate society was very quickly, so to speak, becoming literate. And not just literate in Latin. We're talking literate in Greek and Latin. As time moves on, people start bringing Hebrew in for the same reason they brought, not the same reason they brought Greek. They brought Greek because that was the Byzantines, that was their language. But people started wanting to learn Hebrew because they're like, ooh, if we learn Hebrew, we can read the Old Testament in the original language. I mean, people were on fire. They just wanted to learn. So what was happening, people were becoming literate. They were coming into the church and starting to question, not necessarily push back yet, but question the church. And the church's response, generally speaking, to these inquiries are, you shouldn't be reading the Bible. That's not your job. You're going to misinterpret, you're going to bastardize the Bible. That's what they thought. You are going to take something that's holy and sacred and honorable, and with your little tiny mind, you're going to pervert the scriptures, and you're going to mess them all up. So that was the church's response. Stop reading the scriptures. That's not your job. That's our job. The people's response, maybe under their breath, maybe not. We don't even know Latin. How are you going to teach me anything? You don't even know what you're talking about. Right? Right? So the church's response officially to this movement was something called the Index. This is very important. This stands in effect until the late 60s.
Oh, no.
Okay? The Index. It is a list of writings that the Catholic Church compiles that are illegal.
Again, was this all the popes doing? I mean, making these...
Mm-hmm. Pope Paul the Fourth did this. Pope Paul IV did this. So he established the Index. So now we haven't gotten to Luther yet, but basically the things that would be on the Index, everything from Wycliffe, right? Heretic. Everything from Huss, heretic. As we move forward, everything from Luther, heretic. As we move forward, everything from Calvin, heretic, right? The Bible was on the Index. And the reason it was on the Index is because you have no business reading it and interpreting it without the authority given to an ecclesiastical person by God. So there were all these, what turned out to what we would call, not prophet, what is it called? Martin Luther? No. The split off. Hello. Protestantism. Hello. Anyway, it basically ended up being a whole bunch of Protestant writings, but this was on there. Anything that would entice the people away from the church. And at this time, and again, primarily the reason it was happening is because the clergy had no education and the public had education, but it made the Bible a threat to the church. Okay? All right, so the Index was instituted. The date that I have is 1559. Now, because of the printing press, you could get, and this is so general, basically you can get anything you want in print. You can get copies of scriptures, you can get copies of Wycliffe, you can get copies of Huss, like you can get copies of anything you can afford to get your hands on, right? All right, and the people are doing it. All right, so now, the German Renaissance. So there are all these, so everything I've talked about so far that's happened in Italy, that's known as the Italian Renaissance. Okay, all these languages coming in and blah, blah, blah. Our lens on it is church history. So we're talking about popes and how they acted and whatever, but there's a lot more to the Renaissance than just what we're talking about. So that's what happened in Italy. The German Renaissance was happening about the same time. It began primarily with Gutenberg. He was a German, and this printing press. That is, in general, his invention or reinvention of the printing press. That was what most people call the beginning of the German Renaissance. It was so church history speaking, the German Renaissance was heavily pushed education. I mean, kindergartens were being built, schools were being built, women were allowed to have some education. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff happening, but almost all of it, was education-based. I mean, the German people, kindergarten is a German-based word. They just pushed education, especially of their children, okay? Whether that be of the arts and the artsy things that were going on, the church things that were going on, whatever, because they had the ability to read whatever they could get their hands on and critically think through it and learn from it and apply it to things, right? So they were just reading everything. All right. Erasmus, most people have at least heard of Erasmus. He was prevalent during this time. He and Royslin. Royslin was a Greek and a Hebrew scholar. I'm just giving you some information. He was a huge encouragement to the Germans in general to learn these languages so that they could, especially Hebrew, so that they could read the Old Testament. Erasmus encouraged people to continue to expand on their Greek so that they could do the New Testament. And this time frame, not just in Germany, but this time frame is when the Vulgate began to be not less important, but excuse me, just not the only option. The Vulgate almost became, for lack of a better word, sort of a back burner issue, because they didn't need it anymore. They could read it in their own language and they could interpret it themselves. Or they could have little Bible studies, or they could go take it to somebody who was a scholar and work through these things. All right. So there wasn't too much to the German Reformation. The German Reformation was so overpowered by the Reformation in general that there's just not too much to it. But I wanted to make sure and mention it because he is critical to where we're going. And even Erasmus and Royslin, they're critical to where we're going because they encourage the German people in particular, not just to learn these languages and learn how to read and think critically, but how to get the information around. Okay? So the German Renaissance, if you can even find that term, is important to church history more than it's important to secular history. All right. I already talked about that. Okay, talked about all that. All right, so from 14, I'm writing this up here for time. I'm not going to ask you about this guy on a test. From 1492 to 1503, Pope Alexander the Seventh was in the church. He was leader of the church. This is a very seriously corrupt. It is not. I am not saying that all of the popes of this time were doing this. I'm giving you an example, and quite possibly an extreme example of a corrupt pope. So don't necessarily apply this to all the popes. We're not doing that. I'm just giving you an example of someone who was focused on other things. So he had 8 kids. 5 of them were from one woman, 2 by another, and 1 by another. At one point in time, he brought his 19-year-old girlfriend into the Vatican to live there and be there for him. He gave many of the highest and most authoritative positions that he had control over to his children, some of which were only 8 or 9 years old when they were given the position. He began to hire out his guards, which of this elite army, and he began to fund political assassinations through this army that he had. He hired, and it wasn't really hiring, he forced Raphael and Michelangelo both to come and work for him. That's how the Sistine Chapel came about. All right. I'm sorry?
Is this the Borgia?
I don't know. I don't know the term, so I'm not sure. I would have to look that up. I'm not even sure what the term is. Borgia?
Yeah, Borja, I think is the real name. Not
Oh, no, I don't know his real name. I would have to look it up. I don't know his real name. But you're right. I'm sure that's not his real name. Okay. Now this date is only, I'm just pointing it out. I'm not going to test you over it. On October 31st, 1501. Okay. Now, when did the Reformation begin? 1517, right? So we're getting real close to the time of what we acknowledge as the Reformation, right? All right. This guy, Alexander, he throws a huge party in the Vatican, brings in prostitutes, just major party. It becomes a full-blown orgy in the Vatican. That really upset the people. That this party in particular was very, very upsetting for the people who knew it was happening. They were, they were just upset about it. He authorized the torture and the killing of a priest in Florence. This priest was actually what we would call today an expository Bible teacher. He was reading the scriptures and teaching it the way that, as we do in this church, the way that he's basically teaching the way that our current pastors teach. And he was tortured and killed by Alexander. I have the name of if you're interested in looking it up, the name of the priest was, I'm not even going to try to say it because I am so not Spanish enough to say this right. But that's the name of the priest that was killed, if you're interested in looking that up. The reason that he was targeted is because he called him out. This priest called him out for his immoral behavior, and he ended up being tortured and killed. The next pope, he ended up overhauling St. Peter's Basilica. The next pope, his name was Julius II. He's known as the warrior pope. Whatever. He was a huge proponent of indulgences. The indulgence rate went way up whenever he became pope, and he began to renovate St. Peter's Basilica with some of that money anyway. Now, the last thing in the last 7 minutes that I want to talk about is this concept of the fullness of time. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, there is a statement made. So, 4 and 5, sorry, I can write that down. So this is a portion of Scripture that's talking about the sons and heirs of Christ. And what it says is, verse 4 says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law," verse 5, "to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." Now, Galatians 4 and 5, that is a reference to Jesus coming in his first coming, when the fullness of time had come. We briefly talked about this fullness of time back whenever we were first starting to meet with one another. The fullness of time includes the fact that Rome had a universal language, the Koine Greek. Rome had basically a universal peace. They had highways that connected one city to another that were safe and easy to travel. And at that point, here comes the Messiah, and he's able to speak a language everyone knows. Those people who learn are able to go anywhere they want to go freely and without fear, and spread the message that needed to be spread, right? So part of this fullness of time that's referred to in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, is all of that's surrounding the first coming of Christ. Okay, Martin Luther, many believe that the time of Martin Luther was another fullness of time. And the reason, I want to make sure I get all of my reasons here. So one of the reasons that is stated is because of all the languages. There was not a universal language the way there was with whenever Christ came, but there were languages and education. It was being pushed, and not just in the, as far as church history is concerned, not at the level of the churches, but the level of the people. The people were learning it, and the people were understanding it. The people were forming relationships with Christ, right? So this languages and the education. The printing press. What they were able to learn, and the new documents that were being produced, they were able to be taken all over, not just that area, but even throughout the country, even outside the country, if the borders between countries were open, and there was free travel. There was this idea of nationalism. We started talking about this way back whenever... we really centered on it whenever the papacy split. Remember whenever the Pope ended up going to Avignon and staying there for a while? And then, the people of France were saying, yeah, this Pope is right. And the people in Rome were like, no, no, no. And then it happened that a new priest was elected in Rome, but he was not recognized. And then we ended up having two popes. And then a third one came in and was supposed to overthrow these two, but all three of them were basically ruling against each other, blah, blah, blah. And then a committee was basically brought together, and an anti-pope was given power. He deposed all three, and he had sort of like that vote. Okay, every community or large community, it could be a nation, what we think of as a nation now, gets a vote. Who do you want to be pope? Who do you want to, they started, so this idea of nationalism was taking deep root at this time. And so Luther, being a German, and with the printing press where he lived, Germany, that was part of the fullness of time because of this, right? You have the decline of the papacy. And then you have this little tiny, this person named Martin Luther, who is a Catholic monk. He is an Augustinian monk. We're going to talk about him next time because naturally I talk too much. We should have been through Luther by now. But so Luther, one of the things I want to impress upon you about Luther, when you read about his life, especially through the lens of Protestantism, like I'm a Protestant, and when I look at Luther, I'm looking at him through the lens of being a Protestant. And I, therefore, am looking at him through an assumed lens that he is a Protestant, right? He was a Protestant way after 1517. He was an Augustinian monk who... we'll go over how he became a monk and blah, blah. It's kind of you can just see the fingerprint of God all over everything that's happening, but whatever. You can't make this stuff up. So anyway, he's in this Augustinian monastery, and he is having a terrible time. He is trying desperately to control his flesh. Remember when we were talking about, now this is not a monastery that's way out in the middle of nowhere and you're barely have enough food to eat. It's not like the first Egyptian monks that were out there. This is a formal monastery. There's food to eat and blah, blah, blah. There's heat, like it's normal. But he was living an ascetic lifestyle within the monastery. He would sleep on cold floors completely naked in the middle of winter for nights on end, trying to freeze out the sin in his life, trying to freeze his flesh into submission. He would go on 3-day fasts, like two or three times a week. Like he would do a 3-day fast and then go one day and do another 3-day fast, and then go 2 days and do another 3-day fast, like whatever. There's no necessarily logic to it, but he just was trying everything he could to just stick a knife into the parts of his flesh that he was unable to control, right? And he was tortured because he couldn't kill his flesh. Nothing he did worked. and he was all this time he's learning and he's reading and he's studying, but he's tortured the whole time. He's just like, oh, I'm such a sinner. He just can't get over it. And the priest that he is in a monastery, or the abbot basically, is born again. And he's telling Luther, you need to read the scriptures. You need to spend your time reading the scriptures and in prayer. Pray and read, pray and read, pray and read, study, pray and read. That is what is going to kill your flesh. And what Luther wanted, which is what most of us want, we want this is what I do and my flesh dies. This is what I do and my flesh lives. But it's not that easy, right? So he was just having a hard time. Well, he ended up we'll talk more about it next week, but he ended up being born again, and like a switch flipped in his head. But he did not instantly become a Protestant. He didn't become born again and say, oh, the Catholic Church, blah, and no, he was an Augustinian monk, absolutely to the core. He loved the Catholic Church. He supported the Catholic Church 100%, and he was in full support of the Pope. Even though, it's the same way as Christians, we are in full support of our government. It doesn't mean that we necessarily agree with everything that's happening, but we don't bash, we don't go after, we don't publicly humiliate, we don't do those things. He fully supported the church and whatever was happening with the church. That's just what he did because that's what monks do, right? So it took a long time. And these 95 theses that he wrote, that was sort of the beginning. When he nailed the theses to that church door, he was not doing it in defiance. He wasn't trying to call out the way that a lot of Protestants will put that light on it. And on some level, he was calling them out, but not in a rebellious, kick him in the shin, publicly sort of way. He was doing what was done at the time. If you had a question that required the higher ups in the church to respond to, it would turn into a debate. I have a question, you give me the answer, and then I have a rebuttal, and you rebut that, and and it turns into a debate. And so nailing the theses on the church door was strictly him saying, I'd like to have a debate. And debate at that time was not like what we think now. It's not a hardcore skin 'em alive sort of thing. It was literally, let's come together. You are church authority. I've been studying the scripture. I would like to discuss this and come to a conclusion. Because he thought that he had found a couple of things that the church was doing. Like all these people were finding out. They were like, where is purgatory in the scripture? Where is the cell of indulgence in the scripture? Where does it say that we can do anything with purgatory if it exists? Like people were asking all of these questions, and he was one of them. And so that was one of his primary questions. Basically, if you have the power, church, if you have the power to remove, so assuming purgatory is even real, if you have the power to reduce the sentence, why are you extorting the people for it? Do it out of love. That's what our God is love. You do these things to help the people. That's what you're here for. Why are you extorting the people to do the thing that only you can do? That was one of his questions, right? And so when he put that on the door, he was simply trying to come to an understanding about how the practices that were currently in place were, how they came about and why they were being practiced and how they were backed up by scripture. That's it. And he was basically ignored until somebody took those theses off that church door. Oh, he's gone. And then Johannes is gone. And they ended up making copies of it and getting it all over Germany. And then the people are like, yeah, how come? Well, that's what really started the uproar. And that's why the printing press is so fundamental and so important to the Protestant movement. Okay? So I'm 5 minutes late. I apologize. So let's say a quick prayer and we're out. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this evening. Thank you for the patience that each of these students have with my just natural long-windedness. I just pray that you will be with them throughout the week and that you will give them time and desire and just fruit from the study that they put into this course. And we ask it all in your name, Jesus. Amen.